Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Montgomery, Alabama. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The year was 1853, when the peculiar case of Isaac Freeman first came to light. What initially appeared as a simple missing person report would gradually unravel into one of the most disturbing cases ever documented in Montgomery County. The investigation began when the prominent Whitfield family reported the disappearance of their property, a man they referred to only as Isaac in their official complaint to the county sheriff. But what the authorities would discover in the coming months would reveal a truth far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Montgomery in the 1850s was a city defined by stark contrasts. Grand mansions with white columns stood proudly on hills overlooking muddy streets lined with modest wooden structures. The Alabama River curved around the city's edge, carrying steamboats loaded with cotton bales bound for Mobile and then across the Atlantic. The river also carried stories, whispers of things that happened in the shadows of those grand houses. The Whitfield plantation sat approximately 3 miles east of the city center, along what was then known as the Old Federal Road. Alexander Whitfield had acquired the land in 1837, gradually expanding his holdings until he possessed over 600 acres of fertile soil where cotton grew in abundance. The main house stood atop a gentle rise, allowing the Whitfields to survey their domain from the wide veranda that wrapped around 3 sides of the white-painted structure. According to county records and tax documents preserved in the Alabama Department of Archives and History, Alexander Whitfield was listed as the owner of 27 enslaved individuals in 1852. The year before the events that would eventually draw the attention of authorities. Among those names was Isaac Freeman, though on the plantation ledgers he was recorded simply as Isaac, aged approximately 34 years. What distinguished Isaac from others on the plantation was a notation in Whitfield's personal journal, discovered years later during an 1868 inventory of abandoned Confederate properties. The notation, dated November 12, 1849, read, "Isaac demonstrates remarkable aptitude with figures. Have begun utilizing his skills in maintaining accounts." This brief entry would later provide investigators with the first clue to understanding the complex series of events that would unfold. On February 7, 1853, Alexander Whitfield submitted a formal complaint to the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office, reporting that Isaac had fled the plantation 3 days prior. The official report, preserved in county records, contains Whitfield's statement that Isaac had stolen several items before disappearing, including a leather-bound ledger and approximately $40 in banknotes. A reward of $100 was offered for his return. What makes this case particularly unusual was the subsequent discovery made by Sheriff Thomas Beardsley on February 15th, when he visited the Whitfield plantation to gather additional information. According to Beardsley's notes, found among his personal papers after his death in 1861, he observed peculiar discrepancies in the plantation's financial records during his visit. Mr. Whitfield appeared unusually agitated when I requested to examine the recent accounts, Beardsley wrote. His wife, Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, seemed similarly distressed by my inquiries regarding the missing man. The sheriff's suspicions were further aroused when Eleanor Whitfield's sister, Margaret Holloway, who was visiting from Selma, made a peculiar remark during his interview. "Isaac knew his place well enough," she reportedly said. "He would never have left of his own accord, not after what happened in the East Field last autumn." When pressed by Beardsley to elaborate, both Mrs. Whitfield and Mrs. Holloway refused to speak further on the matter. For several weeks, the search for Isaac Freeman continued without success. Notices were published in the Montgomery Advertiser, and plantation owners throughout the county were alerted to watch for a man matching his description. But as winter gave way to spring, the official search gradually diminished in intensity. Alexander Whitfield, however, seemed increasingly preoccupied with locating his missing slave, according to accounts from neighboring plantation owners. It wasn't until April 3rd, 1853, that the case took an unexpected turn. A local physician, Dr. James Thornton, came forward with information that would cast the disappearance in an entirely new light. According to Dr. Thornton's sworn statement, preserved in the county courthouse archives, he had been called to the Whitfield plantation on October 28, 1852, to treat an injured slave. The patient, whom he identified as Isaac, had sustained several broken ribs and severe bruising across his back and shoulders. When I inquired as to the cause of these injuries, Dr. Thornton stated, Mr. Whitfield informed me that Isaac had fallen from a hayloft in the barn. However, the nature and pattern of the injuries appeared inconsistent with such an accident. Dr. Thornton further noted that during his examination, Isaac had remained silent, avoiding eye contact, though the physician observed a quality in the man's gaze that suggested he was committing every detail of the interaction to memory. What makes Dr. Thornton's testimony particularly significant is that he chose to come forward only after learning of a discovery made by a local hunter along the banks of Catoma Creek, approximately 4 miles south of the Whitfield plantation. On March 30th, 1853, William Davenport had found a weathered leather satchel half buried in the muddy riverbank. Inside was a leather-bound ledger containing what appeared to be financial records, along with a separate set of pages written in a different hand. The ledger was turned over to Sheriff Beardsley, who recognized it as potentially connected to the Whitfield case. The official financial records showed the plantation's cotton production, expenses, and profits for the years 1850 through 1852. But the additional pages, written in a careful, precise script, told a very different story. According to Sheriff Beardsley's report, dated April 7, 1853, these additional pages appeared to be a separate accounting system, meticulously documenting discrepancies between the official records and actual plantation income. The unofficial ledger suggested that Alexander Whitfield had been systematically underreporting his cotton production to his business partners and to tax authorities, concealing approximately 20% of his annual revenue. Most remarkably, these shadow accounts were signed at the bottom of each page with a small, neat inscription recorded by I.F. The initials matched those of Isaac Freeman. When confronted with this evidence, Alexander Whitfield vehemently denied any knowledge of the second set of accounts, claiming they must have been fabricated by Isaac before his escape. However, Sheriff Beardsley noted in his report that the handwriting in the shadow ledger matched samples of writing found in the overseer's cabin, where Isaac had apparently been permitted to keep certain records as part of his duties. The investigation might have ended there, a case of a plantation owner engaged in financial improprieties being exposed by an enslaved man who then fled, had it not been for the arrival of Jeremiah Wilson in Montgomery on April 23, 1853. Wilson, a cotton broker from Charleston, South Carolina, came to Montgomery on business, but brought with him information that would dramatically alter the understanding of the case. According to court documents filed on April 26th, Wilson provided a sworn statement indicating that he had conducted business with Alexander Whitfield on multiple occasions over the previous 4 years. During these transactions, he had observed Whitfield's reliance on an enslaved man named Isaac, whom Whitfield had repeatedly described as having exceptional skills with numbers and accounts. More significantly, Wilson stated that during his most recent visit to the plantation in January 1853, approximately 3 weeks before Isaac's reported disappearance, He had witnessed a heated exchange between Whitfield and Isaac regarding certain financial calculations. Wilson recalled that Whitfield had appeared unusually agitated and had instructed Isaac to revise certain figures in the plantation ledger. The man called Isaac, Wilson testified, responded in a manner that struck me as unusual, stating that he could not alter the numbers as they stood without creating discrepancies elsewhere in the accounts. Mr. Whitfield then ordered me from the room, but as I departed, I observed him seize Isaac by the collar in a manner suggesting imminent violence. This testimony raised troubling questions about the sequence of events leading to Isaac's disappearance. Sheriff Beardsley, now convinced that the case warranted deeper investigation, obtained a warrant to search the Whitfield plantation more thoroughly. The search, conducted on April 29th, yielded disturbing findings. In the small cabin where the plantation overseer, Silas Jenkins, resided, investigators discovered a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard containing several items of interest. Among them was a folded piece of paper bearing what appeared to be a message written in the same handwriting as the shadow ledger. The message, partially damaged by moisture, read, "Cannot continue this deception. The discrepancies now amount to over $3,000. If Mr. W. discovers my separate accounting, I fear the consequences would be." The remainder of the message was illegible, but its existence suggested that Isaac had been aware of the danger his knowledge presented. Even more concerning was the discovery, in the same hidden space, of a blood-stained cotton shirt, which Dr. Thornton later identified as consistent with the garment Isaac had been wearing during his examination in October. Sheriff Beardsley's investigation now shifted from locating a fugitive slave to determining whether a more serious crime had occurred. On May 3, 1853, he returned to the Whitfield plantation with 4 deputies to conduct a more extensive search of the grounds. Alexander Whitfield, informed of their arrival, reportedly told his wife, "They can search from dawn until dusk. They'll find nothing but what I choose to show them." This statement, overheard by a house servant named Martha Washington and later reported to the authorities, would prove darkly prophetic, for despite searching the main house, outbuildings, and much of the surrounding property, the initial investigation revealed nothing further of significance. It was only when Sheriff Beardsley, acting on information provided by an elderly slave named Solomon, decided to examine an area known as the East Field that the case took its most disturbing turn. Solomon, who was approximately 70 years old in 1853, had been on the plantation since Alexander Whitfield's father had first acquired the property. According to Beardsley's notes, Solomon approached him privately during the search and whispered that if he wished to know what had happened to Isaac, he should look to where the old well lies covered, where no crops grow despite the fertile ground around it. The East Field, located approximately half a mile from the main house, contained a section of approximately 20 square yards, where the cotton plants indeed grew noticeably thinner than in the surrounding area. At the center of this section, Beardsley and his deputies discovered the remains of an old well, covered with wooden planks that had been deliberately nailed down. When the planks were removed, the investigators were met with a foul odor rising from the darkness below. Lowering a lantern into the well shaft, which had long since run dry, they observed what appeared to be a human form lying at the bottom, approximately 30 feet down. It took several hours to retrieve what was confirmed to be a body in an advanced state of decomposition. Dr. James Thornton, called to examine the remains, determined that the deceased was an adult male who had suffered numerous injuries before death, including broken bones in both arms and legs. Although decomposition made precise identification difficult, several factors supported the conclusion that the remains were those of Isaac Freeman. The height and build were consistent with descriptions, and fragments of clothing matched items Isaac was known to wear. Most tellingly, A small metal button found with the remains bore the same distinctive pattern as those on the blood-stained shirt discovered in the overseer's cabin. The medical examination further revealed that the victim had suffered a severe blow to the back of the skull, which Dr. Thornton identified as the likely cause of death. However, the pattern of other injuries suggested that significant violence had occurred before the fatal blow, violence consistent with prolonged beating rather than a fall or accident. On May 10, 1853, Sheriff Beardsley presented his findings to Judge William Crawford, who issued a warrant for the arrest of Alexander Whitfield on suspicion of murder. When deputies arrived at the plantation to serve the warrant, however, they discovered that Whitfield had fled, taking with him several valuables and leaving his wife and 3 children behind. Eleanor Whitfield, now facing the collapse of her family's reputation and livelihood, finally revealed what she knew of the events leading to Isaac's death. Her signed statement, dated May 12, 1853, provides a chilling account of the plantation's dark secrets. According to Mrs. Whitfield, her husband had indeed relied heavily on Isaac's mathematical abilities to maintain the plantation's accounts for several years. This arrangement had worked to Whitfield's advantage until the previous autumn, when financial pressures had led him to begin falsifying records to conceal losses and debts from his business partners. Isaac was instructed to alter the figures, Mrs. Whitfield stated, but I believe he maintained separate, accurate records without my husband's knowledge. When Alexander discovered this separate accounting in late January, he flew into a rage unlike any I had witnessed before. Mrs. Whitfield went on to describe how, on the evening of February 3rd, the day before Isaac was reported missing, she had overheard a violent confrontation in her husband's study. Though she did not witness the events directly, she heard sounds of a struggle, followed by a terrible silence. Later that night, she observed her husband and Silas Jenkins, the overseer, carrying what appeared to be a heavy burden wrapped in canvas from the house toward the east fields. When Alexander returned near dawn, she testified, his clothes were soiled with earth and what I now believe to have been blood. He instructed me to say nothing of what I had seen or heard and informed me that Isaac had fled the plantation after stealing money and documents. Silas Jenkins, the overseer, was located and arrested in Mobile on May 17th. Under questioning, he eventually confirmed the essential elements of Mrs. Whitfield's account, though he claimed that he had merely assisted in disposing of the body after Alexander Whitfield had already killed Isaac. According to Jenkins' testimony, preserved in court records, the confrontation began when Whitfield accused Isaac of betrayal for maintaining the separate ledger. Mr. Whitfield demanded to know who else knew of the true accounts, Jenkins stated. Isaac refused to speak at first, which only enraged Mr. Whitfield further. The beating went on for nearly an hour, with Mr. Whitfield repeatedly striking Isaac with his walking stick. Jenkins claimed that he had not been present for the final, fatal blow, having been sent to ensure that no one approached the study during the interrogation. When he returned, he found Isaac lying motionless on the floor and Whitfield standing over him, the bloodied walking stick still in his hand. He told me that Isaac had fallen and struck his head, Jenkins testified, but it was clear that was not the truth of it. Together, we wrapped the body in canvas and carried it to the old well in the east field. Mr. Whitfield said no one would think to look there, as it had been covered and abandoned for years. Despite an extensive search across Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, Alexander Whitfield was never apprehended. Rumors occasionally surfaced of his presence in Texas, or even that he had fled to Cuba or Brazil, but no confirmed sighting was ever reported to authorities. His disappearance left behind a community struggling to comprehend the darkness that had unfolded in their midst. In the absence of the primary suspect, the case of Isaac Freeman's murder was never brought to trial. Silas Jenkins was charged as an accessory after the fact, and sentenced to 5 years in the state penitentiary, but was released after serving only 2 years when the outbreak of the Civil War created more pressing concerns for Alabama authorities. Eleanor Whitfield and her children remained in Montgomery for several months following her husband's flight, but faced with mounting debts and social ostracism, they eventually relocated to relatives in Virginia. The plantation was sold at auction to cover outstanding debts, with the proceeds falling far short of the property's true value due to the grim reputation it had acquired. Perhaps the most poignant footnote to this tragic case comes from a document discovered during an 1869 survey of abandoned properties in Montgomery County. Among papers found in the former overseer's cabin on what had once been the Whitfield plantation was a small, water-damaged booklet containing what appeared to be poetry, written in the same careful hand identified as Isaac Freeman's. One page, better preserved than most, contained lines that seemed to reflect Freeman's awareness of his precarious position. Numbers do not lie, though men may wish them to. In columns straight and true, I find a justice denied elsewhere. The ledger knows what human hearts conceal. This rare glimpse into the inner thoughts of a man whose life and death might otherwise have been reduced to a mere footnote in county records reminds us of the humanity behind historical statistics. Isaac Freeman, a man who found a measure of power and perhaps identity in his facility with numbers, ultimately fell victim to the very system that had exploited his talents. The abandoned well in the East Field was filled with earth and stones in 1854, according to county records, erasing the physical evidence of the crime. The Whitfield plantation changed hands several times in the decades that followed, with each new owner struggling against the property's reputation. By 1868, the once grand main house stood abandoned, its columns crumbling and its windows dark. Local residents reported avoiding the East Field well into the 1890s, claiming that the ground there remained barren despite repeated attempts to cultivate it. Whether this was due to some quality of the soil or merely the power of collective memory remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that the story of Isaac Freeman lingered in the community's consciousness long after the physical traces of his life had vanished. In 1895, a history professor from Tuskegee Institute named William Harper attempted to compile a more complete account of the case, interviewing elderly residents who still remembered the events of 1853. His unpublished manuscript, portions of which survive in the university archives, suggests that Isaac Freeman had been teaching other enslaved individuals on the Whitfield plantation to read and calculate, activities that would have posed an additional threat to the plantation owner's authority had they been discovered. Harper's research also uncovered suggestions that the shadow ledger maintained by Freeman may have been intended not merely as an accurate accounting of the plantation's finances, but as potential leverage. Several entries in the unofficial records included notations about debts Whitfield owed to various business associates and relatives, information that could have proven damaging had it come to light during Whitfield's lifetime. The most tantalizing possibility raised by Harper's research is that Isaac Freeman may have been planning not just to flee the plantation, but to use his knowledge of Whitfield's financial improprieties to negotiate his own freedom, and possibly that of others. A letter discovered among the papers of a Montgomery attorney, dated January 1853, makes reference to a colored man with exceptional knowledge of certain financial matters seeking legal advice regarding manumission laws in northern states. While it cannot be confirmed that this letter refers to Isaac Freeman, the timing and description are suggestive. The investigation was officially closed in 1869 with a notation in county records stating that the primary suspect, having evaded capture for 16 years and presumed deceased, and witnesses to the events in question being similarly unavailable due to death or displacement following the late conflict. Further pursuit of this matter is deemed impractical. Yet the case of Isaac Freeman continues to resonate because it illuminates aspects of history that official records often obscure. If Freeman was indeed seeking legal pathways to freedom based on his knowledge of Whitfield's fraudulent activities, it would help explain both the timing of his death and the extreme reaction it provoked in Alexander Whitfield. In the shadow accounting that Freeman maintained, we can perceive not just financial calculations, but an assertion of truth in a system designed to deny it. In his death and the attempted concealment of his murder, we see the lengths to which those in power would go to maintain control not just of bodies, but of narratives. In 1957, during renovations to what had once been the Montgomery County Courthouse, workers discovered a sealed metal box behind a cornerstone. Inside was a collection of documents, including Sheriff Beardsley's complete case notes regarding the Freeman investigation. These materials, more detailed than the official reports preserved in county records, revealed that Beardsley had continued to search for Alexander Whitfield until his own death in 1861. The final entry in Beardsley's private journal, dated March 12, 1861, reads, "He received word today of a man matching Whitfield's description residing near Galveston under the name Andrew Williams. War now seems inevitable, and I fear this case, like so many truths, will be buried beneath more pressing concerns. But I cannot forget the man in the well whose only crime was to record the truth as he saw it. Some debts cannot be concealed in false ledgers, but must eventually be reckoned." The story of Isaac Freeman faded from public memory as the 19th century gave way to the 20th. The land that once comprised the Whitfield plantation was eventually divided and redeveloped, with no physical marker to indicate the tragedy that had occurred there. By the time the sealed documents were discovered in 1957, few living residents of Montgomery had any knowledge of the case. Those documents were catalogued and archived, but attracted little scholarly attention until 1967, when historian Margaret Johnson came across them while researching antebellum economic practices in Alabama. Johnson's subsequent paper, Accounting for Power, Literacy, Numeracy, and Resistance in the Case of Isaac Freeman, brought renewed attention to this nearly forgotten chapter in Montgomery's history. Today, the precise location of the old well where Isaac Freeman's body was discovered has been lost to time and development. The physical traces of his life and death have vanished, subsumed by the inexorable forward movement of history. Yet in the fragmented documents that survive, the official reports, personal journals, and shadowy financial records, we can still discern the outlines of a man who used the very tools of his oppression to create a space for truth. Perhaps the most fitting memorial to Isaac Freeman lies not in stone or brass, but in the power of documentation itself, the power to record, to reveal, and ultimately to bear witness across the vast silence of years. In the careful columns of figures that he maintained, both official and unofficial, Freeman created a testament more enduring than the system that sought to define and confine him. The final entry in the Shadow Ledger, dated January 28, 1853, just days before Freeman's death, contains a simple notation. All accounts must eventually balance. What is hidden will be brought to light. Whether this was intended as a practical observation about financial records or a more profound statement about justice remains open to interpretation. But in the story of Isaac Freeman, both meanings resonate across time. When the sun sets over modern Montgomery, few who walk its streets are aware of the drama that unfolded there in those winter days of 1853. The city has transformed many times over, with new structures rising where old ones fell, and new stories overlaying the old. Yet beneath the visible surface of history, in archives and memories, and the very soil itself, traces remain of lives like Isaac Freeman's, lives that remind us how the past continues to speak, if only we have the patience and courage to listen. And perhaps in some forgotten corner of the world, the descendants of Alexander Whitfield still carry the burden of a history never fully acknowledged, a debt in the ledger of time that, as Isaac Freeman might have observed, must eventually come due.